Hey, everybody, welcome back from spring break. So, strange way to be welcoming you all back from spring break, but what hasn't been strange this school year? So, let's get started. Today's Ed puzzle: Will there be a war? A story of isolationists, interventionists, and President Roosevelt's dilemma. So, I want to remind you of our theme: isolation versus intervention. This is a theme that I introduced back when we were talking about foreign policy and the Spanish American War and the Philippines and all that good stuff. The idea of isolation is to stay out of foreign affairs, intervention to get more involved. And so, twice in the history of the 20th century, there has been a world war. Twice in the history of the 20th century, the United States has desperately tried to stay out of that war by being isolationists. And twice in the history of the 20th century, the United States has failed to stay out of those world wars. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. And we're going to focus on Roosevelt's dilemma on, the dealing with public opinion and how to keep the nation, give people what they want while we're in the midst of a Great Depression. And so I want to start off our lesson by looking at the problem of presentism. So, presentism means a failure to recognize that people in the past didn't know what we now know, right? It's hindsight. Looking back is always 2020 vision. You always sort of know, well, why did they make these decisions knowing that Hitler was this like crazy guy? Because they didn't know all those things then. And I think that you guys probably better understand than most students have in the past this problem of presentism. It's going to be because, like, you know that you don't know when this pandemic is going to be truly over yet. You understand that experience of living through history in a way that previous students haven't. And just to give you a stupid example, like let's say you're telling the story about, your school year to your grandchildren years from now, and you talk about how you left your favorite sweatshirt at school and you never got it back because you thought you'd be going back to school in 2 weeks, and your granddaughter says, "Well, why didn't you just take everything home once they closed school?" Because your granddaughter knows that school would have been closed for a year. But back last spring, none of us knew that. We all thought we'd be coming back to school in maybe a few more weeks. So that's what I mean by presentism. And so, even though we know that the United States is going to get into a world war, even though we know that Hitler did all these terrible things, you have to remember that back then people didn't know that. And I think that's such an important thing to understand. So, and also it's because there's other things going on in the world. So, what's going on while Americans are busy worrying about the Great Depression? They're worried about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism. And so, let me just hold on, go to present mode here. Okay. Um, and Oh, cool. It worked. All right. So Americans are worried about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, and they're worried about that in Germany, in in Japan, in Italy, in Spain, and in the Soviet Union, as all of these sort of fascist and totalitarian dictators take place. Now, I should stop and pause for a second here and explain that. Totalitarianism and fascism aren't exactly the same thing. They're both oppressive, have a tendency towards evil, but one can be a fascist without being totalitarian, and one can be totalitarian without necessarily being a fascist. Italy was sort of both. Germany was more, and Spain were more one, and it's just complicated. But that's more complicated than I think we need to be, given remote learning and all. So just one thing I want to keep in mind, so you don't get mad at your history teachers in the future, or me. Okay. So let's see. Let me just make myself go away. Okay. So what I want to do is sort of tell you the story about what happened in the world starting in 1931. And that's why the years of our unit start with 1931, even though most textbooks go with 1933, which is when Hitler came to power. I like to start with Japan because Japan actually invaded Manchuria, which is part of China, in 1931. And since the United States gets involved in World War II because of Japan, I think that's an important part of the story to tell. So that's the first news that, Americans are listening to. But, whatever. That's happening, on the other side of the planet, and everybody's worried about the Great Depression and the bad job that Hoover's doing. And so nobody's really all that worried about what's going on in Japan. Flash forward 2 years later, and Germany and Japan both quit something called the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is not something that we talked about because we sort of skipped World War I, but after World War I, President Wilson got this idea to have a league or an organization of a group of countries so that they could prevent a world war from ever happening again. Well, obviously that didn't work out because we have World War II. But this was not, the organization didn't really go so well. The United States never actually became a part of the League of Nations. Eventually, now we have something called the United Nations, which came out of World War II. But in 1933, both Germany, after Adolf Hitler took power, and Japan quit the organization, which is not like a good sign if you're looking for peace. And so that's kind of the first thing that happens that really strikes people's, attention. And there's other things going on in Germany too that we'll talk about when we're live or Zoom school next week. All right, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in East Africa, and went to war. And this was sort of a major signal too. Like Japan's taking over places in Asia now. Italy's invading places, and for some people who pay more attention to world affairs, that might have been concerning. And then in March 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland. Now, if you look on this map over here, you can see that the Rhineland is this western part of Germany that borders France. This is where the worst of the fighting in World War I took place. And so that was concerning. Part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I is that Germany could not put troops there again. They didn't want to start another war. And so the fact that he is just totally violating that and sending in all these troops certainly has the French worried. And people elsewhere in Europe as worried as well. In July 1936, I know I'm going kind of fast here. This is just to give you the basic idea. Okay, you'll get this in more detail when you get to world history next year. So in July 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain. General Francisco Franco, he was part of the Nationalists, which was a kind of more fascist, not so great government, began a rebellion against the democratically elected Republicans. The Republicans asked for help from Britain and from France, who declined. Franco asked help from Germany and Italy, who said yes. And so Hitler supported Franco. And the United States didn't do anything. Britain didn't do anything. France didn't do anything. And so it was kind of a dress rehearsal in a lot of ways for World War II, because Hitler was able to help out Spain, try out some of his military techniques. And Hitler also got a very clear message from the other democracies, from Britain and France, that nobody was really going to, bust their necks to do anything to stop this kind of thing. So this is a famous cartoon by Dr. Seuss. He did a lot of political cartoons during World War II. So ostriches are a creature that bury their heads in the sand when they get scared. So this is a play on that. The cartoon's actually from 1941, so it's a little bit later than the dates that we're talking about right now. But it's helpful, I think, in terms of understanding the attitudes of Americans at the time. So check out this cartoon. We're going to pause for a couple of quick questions. So the effort is clearly to maintain neutrality, to not be involved in the war. So let's go ahead now to the top world news of 1937 and 1938. Looking at 1937, let's start right here. Can you tell what city this is? Let me just get rid of myself. Look closely. It's got to be somewhere in the United States, because there's General Electric over here. Sorry, that arrow should be up here. And it's on the water, seems to be a river. And these two buildings might look familiar to you. Baby Ruth made. Ready? That's right. It was Chicago. Wrigley Building on the left, Tribune Tower at the right. And this over here is Lakeshore Drive. So this was a project of the PWA, the Public Works Administration of the New Deal, to build this bridge over the river. A major public works project, got lots of jobs for a lot of Chicagoans who are still in the middle of this Great Depression. And so FDR came to Chicago to the dedication ceremony. There he is in his car. You remember that a lot of times he stayed in his car whenever possible, for the dedication ceremony on October 5th, 1937. There was a lot of celebration, not a whole lot of social distancing, as people were really excited about this project. And he gave a speech, very famous speech called the quarantine speech. And this is an excerpt only, which I spelled wrong up here, but I'm not fixing. And this is an excerpt from the speech. He said, "It seems that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. War is a contagion, whether it be declared or undeclared. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostilities. Who's remote from what all the stuff that's going on in Europe? We are. We are determined to keep out of war. Yet, notice that word yet, we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement. We are adopting such measures as will minimize our risk of involvement." So let's go to December 1937, just a couple months later. Japan is now full on at war with China, and the Japanese sink a United States ship called the USS Panay. 3 Americans are killed, 48 are wounded. This is a major international event. Obviously, Americans are outraged by this. This was one of the things that got us involved in World War I with all the bombing of German submarines bombing against US ships, including the Lusitania in 1916, and then submarines sinking other ships. But it's 1937. Americans are not ready to go to war. And so what FDR does is he doesn't look the other way exactly, but they just don't make a big international deal about it. And that again sort of shows Japan that the United States is, I mean, it shows Japan just like, Hitler was sort of saw with the Spanish Civil War, that democratic countries are not going to go out of their way to stop this. Everybody's been too burnt too badly from World War I to get involved in these things. So Japan is emboldened. There's a brutal invasion of China by Japan. It's called the Rape of Nanjing because it's so horrific. The stories that you can read about it and the photographs are among the most horrific things I have ever seen and involve a lot of the death of a lot of civilians. You saw that in the Edpuzzle from before spring break on called The Fallen. All right, now let's go back to Europe. In March of 1938, it was an event called the Anschluss. The Anschluss is when Hitler took over Austria. How do you suppose the Austrians felt about this? Actually, the Austrians were kind of okay with this, at least the ones that weren't Jewish. Here's a couple of photographs that sort of show you the Austrian people welcoming, Hitler's army marching into Austria. So this was pretty exciting for a lot of people. And now Hitler has his eyes elsewhere. So here's Austria that Hitler has now taken over. So you see Nazi Germany includes now Austria. And here's the Rhineland where you already saw that Hitler moved in his troops. And now he's got his eyes on an area called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was part of Czechoslovakia. It's an area that historically has always had a lot of German-speaking people, though it was never part of Germany. And he's sort of got his eyes on it. The other thing that's interesting about the Sudetenland is the part of Czechoslovakia that has all the industry and commerce and things. So if there's coal there and all kinds of raw materials that are going to be important if you're, thinking about starting a war. So now Britain and France are in a little bit of a dilemma here. They've looked the other way on some of these other things about Hitler, building up troops here, taking over Australia. But now he's talking about a whole nother country. So they hold a conference. It's called the Munich Conference. And it was held in September of 1938. And you can see from this famous photograph at the end of the conference, this is the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain shaking hands with Adolf Hitler, and the French and Italians and other people are looking on. And what they basically agreed to do, what Britain and France and Italy agreed was, okay, let's just let Hitler take this little sliver of Czechoslovakia, because better to do that than take the whole thing, start another war. Let's just give in to him for now. And so they made a deal. And famously, Neville Chamberlain said that this will lead to peace in our time. Now, that's kind of ironic, of course, because you all know we did not have peace in our time. In fact, World War II would break out exactly a year later. But nobody knows that yet, right? It's the problem of presentism. We know what's going to happen. But at the time, people had reason to believe that maybe Hitler was reasonable and that this would be fine and this whole problem of Czechoslovakia would just go away. Now, check out this cartoon by Dr. Seuss that sort of opines on this issue. So, was the United States at this conference in Munich? Should the United States do something about this? At least in the short term, would this deal, this policy of appeasement, would it stop Hitler from taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia? All right, stay tuned for part 2 of this Edpuzzle, where you will find out whether or not Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia and whether or not there was a world war. Thanks for watching.